A biblical genealogy is a big list of names, basically. Every once in a while, the Bible pauses from telling a story or imparting wisdom and just takes a page or two to show you a really big family tree. The book of Genesis has a few of these, like chapter 10, which is just a list of Noah's descendants, and then his descendants, and then their descendants, and so on. Right after that, though, is the Tower of Babel, one of the most famous stories in Christian mythology. You probably know the basic structure. All the people of the earth, united by a shared language, come together to construct a building that will be so tall that it reaches the heavens. God sees what everybody is up to, and he is not happy. He goes down to confound their language, so they can't work together anymore. They splinter off and form the various nations of the earth. Nation in that time meant something very different than what we mean today. What you may not know is what God says about the state of things just before he splits everybody up. He doesn't say that he's angry with the people because they're trying to reach upon his kingdom. They don't say that they've transgressed against anything in particular. He only says of the united people, now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. It's an interesting parallel to the modern cliche, your only limit is your imagination, but it doesn't answer the question of why exactly God has done this. Why is it that God needed to split us up? What would we have done if it were not restrained from us? We don't get answers to these questions. Verse 9 just concludes, "From thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of the earth." And then verse 10 abruptly starts another genealogy. These are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old when he begat so-and-so, as though one of the weirdest stories in the Bible didn't just happen. Humanity has just been scattered upon the face of the earth, and the Bible just moves on to whoever Shem is. And what are we today supposed to do with this? I mean, we can speculate, we can guess what God was thinking, but none of that changes the fact that we have been scattered without seeming explanation.
Nothing to be done.
As Kay approaches a snow-blanketed village in twilight in the exposition of Das Schloss, he cannot see the castle for which the novel is titled. He instead stands on a bridge, looking up over the village into scheinbare Leere, into apparent nothingness where the castle should be. He goes down in search of a place to rest, and finds an inn where the landlord offers a straw mattress next to the warm stove of the saloon. He falls asleep, briefly, before a castle official wakes him up, demanding to see a permit and Erlaubnis. Kay doesn't have a permit, but he explains that he is the land surveyor sent for by the castle, so he can probably just head up there and ask the Count for the necessary paperwork. The young official is having none of this, however. The Count will not be awoken at midnight to give some stranger, probably a scheming vagabond, a permit to spend the night. He telephones the castle to ask if anybody has summoned a land surveyor. Soon thereafter, he hangs up and announces to the now intrigued occupants of the bar that no such summons has been made. Kay is apparently loitering on the Count's property. Kay fears the bar is about to fall on top of him when the phone rings again, and the official learns that there has been a mistake. A land surveyor was actually summoned. Kay is telling the truth. This first strange encounter is the solitary victorious one that Kay has with the persistent monster of this story, the insurmountable, ineffectual, and incomprehensibly vast castle bureaucracy. Like almost all works of fiction, Franz Kafka's stories are at least somewhat autobiographical, even if he did not consciously intend for them to be. Kafka's work on Das Schloss, published posthumously by Max Brod, began the day he arrived in the Czech mountain resort town of Sprindelov Mlýn, I apologize to the Czech language, then called Sprindermühle in German. This photo of Kafka, the day he arrived, with deep snow covering the earth and trees in the background, is reminiscent of Kay's emergence from the forest at the beginning of the castle, though Kafka's journey seems less Once Upon a Midnight Dreary and more Winter Wonderland to me. The inspiration for the physical location seems fairly obvious, but the castle is not about Kay's ski vacation. It is rather a bizarre journey through the machinations of a distant and perverse paper-worshipping cult. Kafka's fascination with giant, inaccessible bureaucracies is also found in Der Prozess, his other big novel, The Trial. Sprindermühle does not hold all the answers, even if the village's name was created by a German clerical error, which is probably in the top 100 best coincidences in human history. Kafka studied law before being employed at the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute in Prague, which employed him for the majority of his adult life. This alone sets Kafka apart from the popularly imagined writer. Where we usually imagine Camus, Tolkien, and Goethe engrossed in writing and creative invention all day, Kafka spent his days processing claims of injury and investigating factory conditions to ensure accidents, which his company would have to pay for, did not happen. He loathed his condition working for the Institute. He would write in his diary, "My job is unbearable to me because it conflicts with my only desire and my only calling, which is literature." The connection is obvious, and with this context, the castle becomes a hyper-projected hate fantasy. That which prevented Kay's self-actualization gets amplified to this grotesque and absurd level in his fiction. Kay, totally not a stand-in for Kafka himself, is prevented from doing what he wants or needs to do by, of all things, a managerial office covered in paperwork. This office is so good at preventing Kay from doing what he needs to do that no progress in what would otherwise be the novel's primary conflict is ever made. He never gets a conversation with Head Secretary Klam, he never gets to do any land surveying, he never even goes up to the castle to confront the paper cult, which the villagers would regard as the most taboo thing he could do in his situation, even if it is just up a hill. Kay instead spends the novel meandering through the village, listening to the residents' long monologues about the bureaucracy, briefly becoming employed as the school janitor, etc. Kay is trapped in the noise of this arbitrarily organized existence. He is endlessly caught in episodic distractions that prevent him from unlocking the castle, as it were. Schloss is also the German word for lock. Kafka uses these double meanings and homophones throughout Das Schloss. The main secretary Kay wants a meeting with, Klam, gets his name from the Czech word for illusion, but Klam could also mean a ravine in German. Klam is an illusion, a big gap, a void. Kay only realizes the apparent futility of his situation at the novel's end, and seems to surrender to his fate, again, not unlike the end of the trial. But Kay now came to a halt, despite all the dragging. "I know why you want to take me with you," Kay said finally, and let himself be led through the darkness. The novel ends with Kay arriving at the coachman Gerstecker's residence under the cover of night. Gerstecker has hired Kay to tend to his horses because he thinks Kay can get something out of Erlanger, one of Klam's secretaries. Kay walks into the dimly lit cottage and sits next to Gerstecker's mother. The novel ends with this incomplete sentence. "She spoke with great difficulty. It was difficult to understand her, but what she said..." It is attractive and straightforward to read Kafka this way. Kafka's hopelessness at the hands of bureaucracy seems inspired not only by his employment at the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute, but by the broader socio-political environment of Europe. For example, totally random example, travel between the newly founded nations of Europe was not strictly regulated before the First World War. Rather, free travel had been more or less the norm for hundreds of years. After 1919, however, vast regulatory bodies metastasized across Europe that monitored and prevented the comings and goings of supposedly free people. One European would write, "When we were together, and by we, I mean those of us who used to discuss the poetry of Baudelaire and hold impassioned conversations on intellectual problems, we found ourselves talking about affidavits and permits, and whether to apply for a long-term visa or a tourist visa. In the last decade, knowing a girl who works in a consulate and can cut the waiting time short has been crucially more important than the friendship of someone like Toscanini or Roland. We have been constantly made to feel that we might have been born free, but we were now regarded as objects, not subjects, and nothing was our right, but was merely a favor granted to us by the authorities. We have been repeatedly questioned, registered, issued with numbers searched, rubber-stamped, and today, I regard every one of those rubber stamps in my passport as a brand. All those questionings and searches as demeaning." But if Kafka was only a product of his time, the sum of his environment, why is nobody else like him? No great author or dramatist wrote like Kafka before he wrote like himself, even though his circumstances were not particularly unique. Peter Gay, in the excellent Modernism, The Lure of Heresy, calls Kafka an accidental modernist, simply writing because he felt compelled to write, not necessarily because he wanted to pen stunning indictments of the socio-political state of Europe, but in the process of following his idiosyncrasies, upset conventional, time-honored ways with fiction without explanation, let alone apology. That quote about affidavits and permits was not written in a diary or letter by Franz Kafka, but rather Stefan Zweig, who is not widely known in the English-speaking world, but was, at a time, the most translated author in the world. It is taken from Zweig's very quotable memoir and suicide note, Die Welt von gestern, or The World of Yesterday, in which he mourns the loss of pre-war innocence, of Europe in an age of civility and culture, which was smothered in mustard gas and covered in corpses in the First World War. Zweig here is very Kafkaesque. The corrupt bureaucracy, the dehumanization, it's all there, basically. The main issue is, if you know Zweig, that Zweig does not write like Kafka. Zweig's writing is dynamic and emotional, his characters sympathetic and human. If you've seen the excellent film The Grand Budapest Hotel, which was inspired by Zweig's novels, you know the nostalgic warmth of his writing. Kafka's writing, on the other hand, has all the humanity and sex appeal of a laundry basket full of W-2s. And that is my point in invoking Zweig. Kafka's writings are not caricatures of the mere contemporary. His conflicts are far more existential in origin. The causes of the First World War date back well before the Yugoslav nationalist Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Burgeoning nationalism upset the concert of Europe, the precarious balance of power established by the empires of Europe after the defeat of Napoleon. The Second Industrial Revolution, from roughly the 1870s onward, ushered in advances in military technology and greatly increased the scale of mass production. Social tensions and labor movements threatened to upset the capitalist status quo. At the same time, the brutal colonization of Africa and Asia created further territorial disputes and worsened rivalries not only among European powers, but also with the United States and Japan. An even older shadow looms over the First World War, however, one not often discussed in the United States, and that is the shadow of the incredibly influential 19th century German philosopher Hegel and his understanding of history. Hegel is probably most famously known for his dialectic, a process of rational inquiry which a given idea or thesis is challenged by its opposite or antithesis. The tension between these contrasting ideas is then resolved through a new synthesis, which reconciles the conflict and forms a new, higher level of understanding that hopefully more closely approximates the objective truth. Hegel taught that history was a rational and dialectic process, whose culmination would be the realization of a perfect state, guided by der Weltgeist, or world spirit, and abstract realization of the dialectic forces of history. Hegel described this historical process as the path of liberation for the spiritual substance, the deed by which the absolute final aim of the world is realized in it, and the merely implicit mind achieves consciousness and self-consciousness. It is thus the revelation and actuality of its essential and completed essence, whereby it becomes to the outward eye a universal spirit, a world mind. This view of history as a process culminating in the realization of a perfect state is known as historicism. Historicism can be found in various utopian philosophies, from Christianity to Marx's historical materialism. Christian historicism often manifests in men who believe that they have deciphered a biblical code and predicted the date of Christ's second coming, though it is also implicit in the mystery of faith. Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. The most famous pre-World War Christian historicist was a man named William Miller, who amassed a large following that believed Christ would return on October 22, 1844, and who disbanded when he did not. Historical materialism applies the Hegelian dialectic to economic systems. Marx and Engels argued that as contradictions between the mode of production and the institutions of society built up, the economic and political system must either adapt or collapse. They viewed the collapse of capitalism, for example, as imminent, with the realization of global communism following as a natural consequence. However, it has been well over 100 years since Marx and Engels died, and yet we do not live under global communism. suggesting that a reevaluation of their theory might be in order. These theories that predict the realization of the perfect state in apocalyptic terms were a large part of the early 20th century philosophical zeitgeist. H.G. Wells saw the cataclysmic destruction of Europe as a rare opportunity to dissolve the status quo and to instate liberal democracies across Europe. He would write a series of pamphlets on similar topics, later compiled into a book called The War That Will End War, which popularized the overly sentimental and idealist phrase. Vladimir Lenin started a revolution in Russia, which, after a bloody civil war, created a communist state, the Soviet Union. After the war was over, Woodrow Wilson pushed for the establishment of a League of Nations, whose mission would be to prevent future wars and to ensure lasting global cooperation. All of these were false keys to a mocking peace because historicism itself is flawed. There will be no end to history brought about by realizing the utopia. The narrative is a fantasy, albeit a very appealing one. Not even Hegel could resist writing it into his own life. Hegel was teaching at the University of Jena when Napoleon Bonaparte invaded in 1806. He would write, "I saw the emperor, this world soul, riding out of the city on reconnaissance. It is indeed a wonderful sensation to see such an individual who, concentrated here at a single point astride a horse, reaches out over the world and masters it." As we know, Napoleon did not usher in the utopia. Rather, his defeat created the exact political tensions that would cause the war to end all wars. And rather than end all of them, the horrors of World War I were only the prelude to the most stunning atrocities and crimes in human history. The Holocaust, the Gulag Archipelago, and the invention of new crimes against humanity. Nothing to be done, says Estragon. He sits on a pile of rubble, looking like the remains of a bombed-out building. And he's right. For that time and place that he and Vladimir occupy, there is nothing to be done. There remains nothing to be done, so they just wait. They wait for Godot, for then, they think, they will be saved. Waiting for Godot is the crowning achievement of the theater of the absurd, a literary movement of the 1950s that confronted the indifferent and callous nature of human existence in the universe. Absurdism as a philosophy and also as a literary conceit is, I think, the logical conclusion of existentialism, that school which is most often associated with Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, and Nietzsche. Where the existentialist's first question is, what is there to do about the problem that life is suffering? The absurdists ask, what is there to do about the problem that life is meaningless? I do not mean to imply that these schools were mutually exclusive, but one evolved from the other. Nothing happens in Godot, except for all the things that happen, obviously. Estragon, also called Gogo, struggles to take off his boots. Vladimir, also called Didi, discusses the two men crucified along with the Christ, and a fat caricature of the 19th century drags a slave along their path and variously opines on the virtues of culture and civility, before whipping his slave to dance and to think for their entertainment. Waiting for Godot is very strange, but it is also very funny.
Do you remember the Gospels?
I remember the maps of the Holy Land. Colour they were. Very pretty. The Dead Sea was pale blue. The very look of it made me thirsty. That's where we'll go, I used to say. That's where we'll go for our honeymoon. We'll swim. We'll be happy.
You should have been a poet.
I was. Isn't that obvious?
The strangest and therefore most memorable moment in Godot, for me, is Lucky's monologue. Lucky is mute for most of the show, simply carrying Pozzo's luggage to an auction where Pozzo is going to sell him, but after he is given a hat and commanded to
think,
he conjures a speech full of theological cliches, discussions of sport, and utter nonsense.
Given the existence as uttered forth in the public works of Puncher and Watman of a personal God, qua, 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 with white beard, qua, 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 outside time, without extension, who from the heights of divine apathia, divine athambia, divine aphasia, loves us dearly, with some exceptions, for reasons unknown, but time will tell.
This goes on for some time before Vladimir takes Lucky's hat, which abruptly ends the monologue, and Lucky falls to the ground.
Avenged! Give me that! There's an end to his thinking!
But the central issue is Goddo himself. Though he is frequently mentioned, he never arrives. In fact, not only does he never arrive, it seems like Gogo and Didi are trapped in an eternal recurrence waiting for him. At the end of the first act, just before moonrise, a young boy shows up to inform Vladimir that Goddo will not be coming today, but promises that he will be there tomorrow. The next day, in the second act comes up, Putzo and Lucky come up again, and again, the day ends with the same young boy informing Vladimir that Goddo will not be coming today, but promises that he will be there tomorrow. Vladimir and Estragon realize the futility of their situation and try to escape via suicide. Estragon suggests they use his belt to hang themselves from the tree in the background, which snaps before they can make a noose out of it. They give up for the night and go home, promising to bring some rope for tomorrow if Goddo does not show up. The last lines of the show read,
Shall we go?
Yes. Let's go.
followed by the blocking, they do not move. The most obvious work to put waiting for Goddo in conversation with is The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus, because it deals with the same problems as Goddo: our need for meaning in life, the indifferent universe, and suicide. The Myth of Sisyphus is, of course, the incredibly famous and influential essay in which Camus introduces his philosophy of the absurd, his solution to the problem that life is meaningless. The absurd, as Camus describes it, is the resulting emotional experience that comes from understanding the following contradictory truths: that life is meaningless, that we can create no meaning in life, and that we are compelled to find meaning despite nature's indifference. He writes, "What is that incalculable feeling that deprives the mind of sleep necessary to life? This divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, is properly the feeling of absurdity." Camus wrote The Myth of Sisyphus largely to address suicide, which he saw as the fundamental issue of philosophy. If you do not think your life is worth living, then you will devote little time to asking if the mind is embodied or external in a soul, if God exists or not, and so on. Camus does not see suicide as a valid choice. He sees it as a tragedy that fails to confront the absurd. What he demands of us instead is to be like Sisyphus, trapped in a meaningless existence, cursed to complete an impossible task, which we know is impossible, but to bear the burden anyways. The burden, the bearing of that unbearable weight, is the justification for going on. He writes, "The struggle toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy." I am partial to this reading of Goddo in the context of Sisyphus, but I cannot fully endorse it here because I think Goddo is more damning as a commentary on historicism and utopia, rather than a meditation on individual psychology. I am rather more interested in Waiting for Goddo as a political and historical text, and I think it is better put in conversation with The Castle. And it's not just because they parallel each other narratively and thematically, but because they teach us the same lesson: that there is no ultimate answer, not in God, not at the end of history, and certainly not in a utopian political ideology. Those who live their lives in search of the ultimate truth will never find it. Estragon says, "Let's go," and they do not move. Kay leans in to hear Gerstekker's mother. It was very difficult to understand her, but what she said, and the story ends. There is no glory in the great struggle toward eternal peace for Kafka and Beckett because they knew those were false keys. Peace for them seems rather to exist when we surrender utopian ambition and we do what we can in life earnestly without pretense. That does not mean that we should roll over and surrender to injustice or let history just wash over us. Rather, since we are in control of our lives, not a Weltzähler or God, we have a responsibility to ourselves and to each other to not let things fall apart. The gates of heaven will remain locked, and we are stuck here, where we must face our own insufficiencies and confront the absurd without pretense. But that is not a tragedy. It is rather a boundless opportunity for honesty, accountability, and kindness. I've been writing this piece for my senior recital that sets text from the great 17th century mathematician and philosopher Pascal's Pensées, his thoughts or meditations, roughly. It's not done yet, so I can't show you, but I think the text is relevant nonetheless. Pascal writes, "When I consider the brief span of my life, swallowed up in the eternity before and behind it, the small space that I fill, or even see, engulfed in the infinite immensity of spaces which I know not and which know not me, I am afraid, and wonder to see myself here rather than there, for there is no reason why I should be here rather than there, now rather than then. Who has set me here? By whose order and arrangement have this place and this time been allotted to me?" Pascal would probably answer God to those questions. He was a fairly devoted Catholic by modern standards, but you don't have to agree with his answers to appreciate the beauty of the passage. Here, Pascal describes what the 20th century philosopher Martin Heidegger, himself a Nazi, believe it or not, would call Geworfenheit, or thrownness. We are thrown into this world, in media res, in the middle of things, without control over where or when we enter. Wherever and whenever we do show up, context, pretense, and history stretch out well before and ahead of us. We are powerless to choose much of our context, who our parents are, where we are born, what kinds of food we can eat, whether or not we will be born with a chronic illness, but to a large extent, most of us are in control of what we choose to do while we are here. We can choose to make things worse for ourselves and therefore the people around us who are situated in space and time as arbitrarily as we are, or we can choose to keep things from falling apart, maybe even try to make things better than they are. So let us be honest, let us be generous, and let us hold ourselves accountable to one another in spite of the universe lacking a plan for us.